Ah, music in the late 60s. So many divergent paths, so many different sounds. Some bands went heavier, some went more complicated, and some, well, they went back to basics. The blues explosion, both in the United States and the United Kingdom, spawned some of the most amazing bands and musicians that often flew under the radar. One such band was a California outfit known as Canned Heat, and before you wonder who, they're the ones who made the classic quintessentially 60s hippie anthem Going Up the Country. The distinctive and hypnotic vocal on that song was performed by another singular musician who left us way too soon, at that eerie age when we lost so many other musical titans like Hendrix, Joplin, Morrison, and Cobain. That singer was blues musician Alan Wilson, and he's going to be our subject next on Forgotten Fretmasters. Hey friends, and welcome once again to Forgotten Fretmasters, where we examine guitarists or musicians who for one reason or another might not have been as commercially successful as, had the longevity of, or left us sooner than some of the other guys who often end up on all the top 10 lists. Today we're looking at a guitarist, harmonica player, and singer from the legendary American blues band Canned Heat, Alan Wilson, whose unmistakable voice and incendiary guitar style would awe anyone who saw him play. Although his career was extremely short, Wilson left us with some amazing stories and a legacy that was way ahead of its time. But if you like classic rock stories like this, be sure to join the guitar historian community, and also be sure to share your experiences of this legendary musician below in the comments section. And if you think other music fans would like the video, also be sure to drop a thumbs up below. Alan Christy Wilson was born on Independence Day, July 4th, 1943, in the Boston suburb of Arlington, Massachusetts. The second child of Jack and Shirley Wilson, they would divorce early in his childhood, but Alan would still remain close with both parents. Alan showed an extremely high level of intelligence and inquisitiveness, and his analytical mind immediately began to pick records apart instrument by instrument, and started to teach himself the parts on trombone, and he would teach his friends how to play the other parts by ear. Despite his high intelligence, though, Alan often struggled with societal norms and maintaining focus. I'm sure that today he would most likely be diagnosed with, at the very least, attention deficit disorder, probably coupled with high-functioning autism. He continued to explore music, especially jazz, all through his high school years, starting a jazz ensemble called Crescent City, but soon a friend would play a Muddy Waters album for Wilson, and this would change his musical direction forever. He was absolutely stunned at the authenticity, simplicity, and power of the vocals and slide guitar, and Alan would teach himself both guitar and harmonica. He knew at a young age that his vocal style was different, and he remembered being embarrassed when he was caught in his room singing by his family. But as the years progressed, Alan became more and more comfortable with his voice, and with the encouragement of friends, he would continue to develop it. Alan's studious nature and unquenchable thirst for knowledge allowed him to skate through school with top grades, earning college scholarships to Boston U, but after about a year and a half, Wilson would drop out to pursue a career in music. Alan found himself both performing and writing about the musical revival in the folk and blues that had been popping up all over New England in the early to mid-1960s. Wilson interviewed bluesman Booker White, and through this interview he would learn a shocking fact that legendary bluesman Son House was still alive. Son House was known as a teacher to legends like Robert Johnson and Muddy Waters themselves, and so, much like what we do here on Forgotten Fretmasters, Wilson took it upon himself to track down Son House and return his name to notoriety. Although Son House's original recordings from the 1930s hadn't been altogether successful, he was known to be a massive influence on the bluesmen who came later, and as such occupies an exalted status to blues fans. When Alan and his friends found House, however, he had been mired in decades of alcoholism and hadn't played music in many years. And so Alan Wilson literally retaught the legendary bluesman how to play his own songs, leading to a wonderful rebirth of Son House's career, culminating in a new record deal with Columbia Records and a successful tour playing small venues to mostly white folk and blues fans in New England. Son House would go on to live to the age of 86, passing away in 1988. Another friend to Alan who was involved in the revival was John Fahey. He also introduced Wilson to bluesmen like Skip James, whose distinctive high-pitched vocal style was a major contributor to Wilson's own vocal style to come. Fahey would enjoy a career as a guitarist in a style dubbed American Primitive, due to the simple and folksy, self-taught style that Fahey employed. As Fahey was working on a thesis about the father of the Delta blues, Charlie Patton, he asked Wilson to accompany him to California to help him with the musical theory part of the thesis. This offer would change Alan Wilson's life. Wilson would move to California with Fahey, but he neglected to pack one of his most important possessions, his glasses. This caused Fahey to lay the moniker of Blind Owl on him, which would eventually morph into Blind Owl, as his scholarly and bookish nature was noticed by his other friends. One story told was that when a band Wilson was playing in was performing at a wedding, Alan inadvertently placed his guitar down after the set right into the wedding cake because he couldn't see 2 feet in front of him. One friend introduced to Wilson by Fahey was a record store manager named Bob Height, who had an encyclopedic knowledge of music and one of the largest record collections around. Height and Wilson were polar opposites of each other, with Height's loud and boisterous personality allowing Wilson's introverted and quiet nature to remain so. Naturally, the pair would form a band together in 1965, originally calling themselves the Canned Heat Blues Band. The name was taken from an old blues song by Tommy Johnson called Canned Heat Blues, which told the story of a desperate poor alcoholic who was forced to drink sterno, a cooking fuel, which was colloquially known as canned heat. Like most bands of the period, Canned Heat would go through a number of lineup changes and revolving doors around the focal point of Height and Wilson, with the early group recording a failed first album in 1966 that would eventually be released later as Vintage Heat in 1970. But eventually in 1967, they settled on a lineup that included Henry Vestine, formerly of Zappa's Mothers of Invention, on second guitar, bass player Larry Taylor, who was a member of the Moondogs and had done vast live session work for acts like Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis, and experienced drummer Frank Cook. Now would be a good time to look at Alan's gear department. Alan would play a few different guitars over the years, but it's not really known if he actually owned all of them or if they had been provided as props or borrowed from other musicians. An early guitar that he probably did own was a white Fender Mustang, but he was also photographed playing a late 60s blonde Fender Telecaster and a cherry Gibson ES335. But his main axe, and the one that he is most known for, was a 1954 Gibson Les Paul Gold Top, sometimes with a small red STP oil sticker between the pickups. The early stop bar tailpiece construction with hot P90 pickups seemed to suit Wilson's imperfect perfection way of playing the guitar. One song that really shows off this guitar's raw tone is on a live version of Heat's well-known hit, Let's Work Together. Look down in the description for a link to that video. This iteration of Heat would enter the studio to record their first proper album that would be released as Canned Heat in 1967 and do moderately well on the charts for a band as niche as they were, reaching number 76. The album was a collection of reworked blues standards, but where Canned Heat was really making strides was on the live circuit, where they were known as a volatile and fun band among the hippie circuit. Their tour was nearly ended early by a drug bust in 1967, in which the band were unknowingly partying in a hotel room with a couple of undercover drug agents. But Wilson was not included in this bust, as he had been, get this, outside collecting leaves. One of Wilson's favorite pastimes was simply communing with nature, and his escape from the hustle and bustle from the everyday world was to get out into nature by himself. He never had the, quote, way with women that his bandmates did, and never truly felt at home in the rock and roll lifestyle. But his love of the music is what kept him going. Wilson's love of nature extended to even sleeping outdoors and camping in the famous redwood forests of California after Bob Height gifted him a camper. But Canned Heat's popularity as a live band would see them performing at some of the most storied live moments of the late 60s. The first was 1967's Monterey Pop Festival, which many blues fans saw as the band's coming out party. The show put Canned Heat on the map and catapulted them to a new level of stardom. They were featured in Downbeat magazine, with the music publication saying, quote, "Technically, Vestine and Wilson are quite possibly the best two-guitar team in the world, and Wilson has certainly become our finest white blues harmonica man. Together with powerhouse vocalist Bob Haidt, they performed the country and Chicago blues idiom of the 1950s so skillfully and naturally that the question of which race the music belongs to becomes totally irrelevant. Shortly after, Frank Cook would depart to be replaced by drummer Fido de la Parra, who incidentally is the only member to carry on the name and perform as Canned Heat to this day. In December of 1967, Heat would play a double top bill with the Doors, and De La Parra remembered to this show as the beginning of what he calls the classic lineup of Canned Heat, with all of the band's top hits coming in the next few years. It was also the time that the band's management decided to lay nicknames on all the members of the band. In addition to Wilson's Blind Owl, Haidt became the Bear, Vestine became Sunflower, and Adolfo de la Parra became Fido. Their second album, Boogie with Canned Heat, included the Wilson song On the Road Again, my personal favorite Heat song, and that song would go on to break a hole in the worldwide charts and turn Canned Heat into a household name. It was also the world's first exposure to Alan Wilson's distinctive vocal style and incendiary harmonica runs. The song was built around a hypnotic droning chord progression, which also showcased Wilson's fascination with Indian music, and although it was officially penned by Wilson, it was based upon songs by bluesman Floyd Jones, who in turn had based his work on a song by the aforementioned Tommy Johnson called Big Road Blues. After the breakout success, Canned Heat would become the house band at LA club The Kaleidoscope, playing with other noted California bands like Jefferson Airplane, The Grateful Dead, Buffalo Springfield, and Sly and the Family Stone. Later in 1968, Heat would embark on a successful European tour where On the Road Again was enjoying massive chart-topping success in multiple countries. It was followed up by Canned Heat's next album, Living the Blues, which included another Wilson-fronted smash in Going Up the Country, which would become the all-time bona fide anthem of the hippie movement and become a touchstone in American popular culture in the late 1960s. Guitarist Henry Vestine, deep in the throes of a drug and alcohol problem, would leave the band suddenly in 1969, leading to a shocking moment during which two guitarists who were jamming with Canned Heat, one named Harvey Mandel and the other named Mike Bloomfield. Both men were offered the job. Mandel accepted first and so joined Canned Heat, but wow, think about Canned Heat with Mike Bloomfield on guitar? Good God. Anyway, Heat's continued success and pocket full of legendary gigs would lead them to be one of the natural acts to populate a legendary new festival that was being put together in rural New York. To be called an Aquarian Exposition, 3 days of peace and music, the ambitious project would be the biggest festival in music history, and I think we all know what happened next. But Going Up the Country would become known as the official anthem of Woodstock, despite the festival having a Joni Mitchell penned song with the same name as the festival that became a huge hit for legends Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. The band would record arguably its greatest album with legendary bluesman John Lee Hooker. Hooker was a fan of Canned Heat's work and even called Wilson the greatest harmonica player ever. Hooker was also struck at how easily Wilson was able to hang with him on guitar, as Hooker is usually not a follower of normal song form and tends to meander through the chords. The album is probably one of the greatest blues recordings ever put to tape. I mean that sincerely. Yes, Canned Heat was certainly riding high in the hippie wave of the late 60s, with their music fitting perfectly with the natural, simple, and laid-back vibes of the movement. But despite all this success, the introverted Alan Wilson was not doing well. Wilson had always been prone to depression and self-deprecating thoughts. His inability to find a romantic partner, unwillingness to cope with the social norms were weighing on him. Self-doubt was a constant companion. It was clear that today we would probably say Wilson fell somewhere on the autism spectrum, but unfortunately the awareness of such conditions was not where it is today, and most close to him didn't understand why Alan had so much trouble with even the simplest social norms that others found naturally easy. Friends would later report that Wilson had expressed suicidal thoughts as well. Also, in accordance with a new focus on pollution and natural preservation, Wilson started a non-profit organization called Music Mountain, which aimed to grow awareness to nature and especially a conservation of the California redwood forests. Wilson would continue to spend much of his time outdoors, but he often found sleep hard to find, even under the stars, and had developed a habit of taking barbiturates before bed to help him sleep and shut his mind off from the problems and thoughts of depression. Wilson was notorious for his forgetfulness and disarray, so when the band showed up at LAX on September 2nd, 1970 to embark on a European tour, they weren't overly worried when Wilson didn't show up. Friends were dispatched back to Bob Hite's home in Topanga Canyon, where Alan often spent time outdoors, especially sleeping on an idyllic tree-covered hillside in the back of the property. But rather than finding their usual disorganized, oversleeping friend, they found Alan Wilson dead in his sleeping bag, a handful of barbiturates in his pocket. He was only 27 years old. The medical examiner ruled his death accidental, as no suicide note had been left. Friends were doubtful, as they had seen and heard Wilson's decline into depression, but however it happened, it was a tragic loss of a truly gentle and wandering soul with an unquenchable thirst for knowledge and a total, unconditional love for the blues music and musicians that he honored with his performances. Today, we should celebrate Alan Wilson's legacy and use his story as a teaching moment for awareness and acceptance of those battling mental illness and those sometimes with undiagnosed social and autistic disorders that are, even today, still widely misunderstood. In the end, we can only hope that Alan was able to find the peace that he so desperately craved. But that is another episode of Forgotten Fretmasters. Thank you so much for joining us this time, and please consider subscribing to the channel to see more stories like this. This is the 9th episode of Forgotten Fretmasters, and we have dozens of other videos that run the entire gamut of rock and blues history. If that sounds good to you, join our community and be sure to comment with any experiences you may have had with Alan Wilson and Canned Heat. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.